Welcome to Justice Trek. My name is Ted Kilvington, and this is an audio and video log that journeys through comic book history as I discuss individual comic book stories of Star Trek, the Justice Society, and the world's greatest superheroes, the Justice League of America. Justice Trek is the only show devoted to the entirety of these great comic book series, from the 1940 debut of the JSA, the launch of the JLA and Star Trek comic books in the 1960s, and right up to comics hot off today's shelves. This show will impact you in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Hey, my name's Ted Kilvington. Welcome to Justice Trek. This is episode 18, where I will be talking about Marvel Comics Star Trek number 6 from 1980. Just want to remind you that we have many other shows for your viewing pleasure, such as episode 16, where I talked about 2022's Star Trek Klingons from IDW, and episode 17, where I talked about 1960's The Brave and the Bold number 29, the second ever appearance of the Justice League of America, with guest villain Xotar, who was so popular he never appeared again. But it was a fun issue. I had a fun time talking about it, and hopefully you would have a fun time listening to it. Getting back to Star Trek. The first time I read Star Trek number 6, Marvel, was about 3 years ago when I bought them off eBay. Got the entire Marvel run, so I read them at that time. My reference copies, I have two. I have the original that I bought in a couple of years ago off eBay, plus I have a reprint in the Eagle Moss Star Trek graphic novel collection, the Marvel Comics Volume 1. Hope you enjoy my coverage of Star Trek comics and Justice League comics and Justice Society comics. And if you do like it, click like, click subscribe. Okay, let's get into it. This comic contains appearances by in order of appearance, Commander Spock, Captain James T. Kirk, Chief Petty Officer Janice Rand, Commander Montgomery Scott, Commander Dr. Leonard McCoy, Lieutenant Commander Nyota Uhura, Lieutenant Commander Hikaru Sulu, Transport Chief Marcella DeFalco, and Lieutenant Pavel Chekhov. Just a little bit of background information. This issue takes place shortly after the events of the 1979 film Star Trek: The Motion Picture. Star Trek number 6 was published June 3rd, 1980 by Marvel Comics with a June cover date and a 50-cent cover price. The Enterprise Murder Case was a 17-page story by Mike W. Barr, writer, or as they credit him on the splash page, the ship's log compiler. Dave Cockrum and Klaus Janson, the visual engineering technicians first class. Rick Parker, recorder. Carl Gafford, hue technician. Louise Jones, captain. Jim Shooter, fleet admiral. And Marianne Stensgaard, historian first class. Mike Barr was the writer. Cockrum and Jansen were the artists. Rick Parker was the letterer. Carl Gafford was the colorist. Louise Jones, editor. Jim Shooter, editor-in-chief. Marianne Stensgaard, no idea what her contribution was. Presumably she contributed some background information, but I'm not aware of how much background information there needed to be for this story. But the synopsis I'm about to read you was taken from memory-beta.fandom.com, presumably not contributed by the Marianne Stensgaard, who was credited in 1980. Captain's log, stardate 7420.1. At last, the Enterprise has established orbit in the crowded skies over the planet Yaned 6, and we can proceed with our mission. The transportation of Ambassador Frall to the treaty signing that will admit his planet to the Federation. Interplanetary diplomacy is a delicate matter, and I have taken special precautions to ensure that there are absolutely no slip-ups. However, a freak transporter malfunction may render all my precautions useless. Frall materializes in the Enterprise transporter room, but falls dead with a dagger in his back. The royal palace from which he was beamed informs Kirk that no one assaulted him on the planet. Captain's log, supplemental. If Ambassador Frall was alive when he left the planet and dead when he reached the Enterprise, he must have been stabbed while in transit. Yet a transporter functions by separating its subjects into their component atoms and reassembling them elsewhere. Kirk asks McCoy to perform an autopsy and Spock to investigate the death. McCoy, who is concerned that Kirk seems irritable, discovers that Frall has been dead for at least 15 minutes, even though he beamed up 5 minutes ago. The computer tapes of Frall's arrival have been erased by an energy surge when Spock reviews a tape of his beam-up from the surface. He finds another discrepancy. Prince Storf and Princess Menax from the Yaned 6 inform Kirk that their planet's agreement with the Federation is non-binding until their uncle's murder is explained. They demand the immediate return of his body and advise Kirk to recall his crew on shore leave, who may be in danger from rebels who want the planet to join the Klingon Empire. They reveal that Frall was formerly known as Prince Arlf, unsettling Kirk. In a tavern on Yaned 6, Sulu, DeFalco, and Chekhov are confronted by rebel sympathizers who blame the Federation for Frall's murder. Other Barr patrons defend the Federation, and a brawl ensues, with the 3 Enterprise officers joining in until they are signaled to beam up. As they dematerialize, one of the rebels who was injured in the fight says, "Just get me to Dr. Lorak." I have no idea what accent the Yanedians, or whatever their demonym is, whatever their accent might be. Admiral Fitzpatrick grants Kirk authority to handle the situation as he sees fit, but notices that Kirk seems edgy. Kirk finally tells Spock, McCoy, and Sulu what has been bothering him. In flashback, he recalls how he visited Yaned 6 as an ensign on the USS Republic. Rebels had murdered King Garor and taken his son, Prince Arlf, hostage. When Kirk led a landing party to rescue the prince, his warning shot ricocheted and struck Arlf himself, putting him in a coma. Arlf's brother became king and cut off ties with the Federation. And when Arlf awoke years later, he blamed Kirk for his losing the throne. He changed his name and became an ambassador. After the king's death, negotiations were reopened, but are now imperiled by Frall's death, for which Kirk appears responsible. Spock theorizes that the murdered man was not Frall, who was seen alive at the time that the victim died, but was a surgically altered duplicate. The body was not wearing a ring of great sentimental value to Frall. Spock suggests that the real Frall wishes to be thought dead and may be undergoing plastic surgery, which leads Sulu to remember the mention of Dr. Lorak. Kirk then requests 3 native disguises from the ship's quartermaster. Captain's log, start date 7420.4. We are beaming down to the planet's surface, attempting to obtain information from Dr. Lorak. Our disguises are serviceable, but not perfect. Beaming down with Kirk and Spock, McCoy complains that the disguises leave their human hands visible. At Dr. Lorak's clinic, Spock nerve pinches the man who meets them at the door. Dr. Lorak herself confronts them with a gun, but is shot from behind and killed. Kirk and Spock find 3 patients in a room at the end of the corridor, while McCoy is apprehended by Prince Storf, Princess Minax, and a group of guards. They join Kirk, Spock, and the 3 patients, one of whom, Kirk points out, must be Frall, who killed Dr. Lorak after she changed his appearance. Spock claims to have made a telepathic scan of the patients and to know which one is Frall. Spock explains that when Frall seemingly beamed aboard the Enterprise, he was actually intercepted by a rebel vessel, while the body of the duplicate that was killed 10 minutes earlier was beamed aboard the starship. The computer tapes were wiped by an energy surge fired from the planet. Frall wanted to humiliate Kirk and disappear with his personal fortune. Frall seizes a guard's phaser and takes Minax hostage, but McCoy knocks him out with a hypospray. As Frall is taken to prison, Storf agrees to sign the treaty to join the Federation. Captain's log, stardate 7421.1. The Federation has added a new member to its roster, and I have, at last, made amends for my earlier visit to Yaned 6. The Prince and Princess are returning to their planet, secure in the knowledge that they have the full support of the Federation, both in peace and, should it become necessary, in war. Spock tells Kirk and McCoy that his telepathic scan was merely a series of deductions, or as McCoy would put it, a bluff. The Enterprise then warps away. The end. Okay, let's take a quick moment. I'm going to play the credits, and afterwards I'll go through my analysis of this issue. Stick around, you'll enjoy it. If you have questions or comments, please feel free to send them to me on Twitter under the handle @JusticeTrek, or via email at thejusticetrek@gmail.com. Be sure to include the word "the" at the beginning of the email address. For research purposes, I rely heavily on dc.fandom.com, memory-alpha.fandom.com, comicvine.gamespot.com, the Grand Comics Database at comics.org, and Mike Boyle's website, Mike's Amazing World of DC Comics at dcindexes.com. The opinions expressed are solely those of the host and any participants. This podcast is not a commercial enterprise and does not make any money. All copyrights are held by their respective owners. The opening sequence was animated by Craig Smith of Phoenix Studios. The opening music is Dragon Slayer by the Makai Symphony. All music used is either public domain and/or not protected by copyright. Under Section 107 of the Copyright Act of 1976, allowance is made for fair use for purposes such as criticism, comments, news reporting, teaching, scholarship, and research. Fair use is a use permitted by copyright statute that might otherwise be infringing. Nonprofit, educational, or personal use tips the balance in favor of fair use. Hey, welcome back. Thanks for sticking around. This issue's cover was penciled by Dave Cockrum and inked by Klaus Janson. The cover image shows the Enterprise in orbit above the planet, while a beam is projected from the ship down to the planet. On the left side of the beam, there is an image of the living Ambassador Frall, and on the right side of the beam is an image of the dead Ambassador. Now, obviously, we don't see the Ambassador floating in space alive or dead, but the image gives the casual browser a very good idea of the story contained within. Now, you may have noticed the banner appearing at the top of this issue's cover. It reads, "This Marvel comic could be worth $5,000 to you." You may also have noticed that the cover price was raised from 40 cents to 50 cents this month. Well, in the month of June 1980, both Marvel Comics and DC Comics raised their cover prices from 40 to 50 cents. DC reacted to the price hike by adding 8 extra story pages, bringing them from 17 story pages per issue to 25, and by placing a big banner on the top of all of their comics announcing that they now had 8 extra pages. Marvel, however, was not prepared at that point to increase their page count, and they thought that they needed some way to react to the fact that individual DC comics would have 25 pages of story for 50 cents versus Marvel Comics' 17 pages of story for 50 cents. So Marvel decided to both do the contest and put the banner promoting the contest on the top of all of their comics that month. Page 1, there was a full page image with the title, the credits. There was a full page splash image which had the title, the credits, and the setup to the story. Now the setup was good, even if the image of someone beaming aboard while Kirk and Spock enter was rather generic. The extruded font in the story title seemed out of place for both Star Trek and Marvel Comics, because usually that font is associated with the Superman logo. Page 2. While it is understandable that Kirk is on edge after we learn about his personal history with the planet Yanid 6, it still seems uncharacteristic for him to be taking his frustrations out on his crew. I mean, even the Admiral could tell that he was out of sorts, and you would think at the very least he would confide in his senior officers, McCoy and Spock, about his frustration. Page 3. Now, in last week's Trek episode, I mentioned how sparse the dialogue was in 2022's Star Trek Klingons. And by contrast, this issue seems especially word-heavy. Now, there may very well be more words in this 17-page story than in all 40 pages of that Star Trek Klingons one-shot from 2022. Now, the quality of a comic book story is not judged by the quantity of words, of course, but it was certainly the case that when a writer was told to tell a story in 17 pages, and they felt that story needed more detail put in, that the writers would put that detail into captions because they didn't have the room to display it all in image form. So that was one of the compromises they had to make back then. So there certainly were a lot of comics that were published, around 1980 that had more text than was perhaps desired because of the space limitations. Similarly, I think there are comics these days that will often use a lot more images to fill up the space, such as in that Star Trek Klingon story. There was not 1, not 2, but 4 two-page spreads. At least 3 of those spreads really could have been lifted out, and you wouldn't have missed them in the context of the story. So that was probably my biggest complaint about the story, was just that it seemed padded and stretched out. It was like telling a 30-page story in a 40-page comic, and just using extra images to kind of fill the gap. And of course, charging double the price because the page count was double. The story was good, don't get me wrong, but I just felt that the actual narrative content did not justify the price being double of a normal comic. Page 4. We finally see Chief DeFalco in a scene with more than one line of dialogue. Previously, in the Marvel Star Trek comics, she had only been seen on duty. And when we first saw her, I didn't remember her from the motion picture. In fact, she not only did appear in that film, She was played by actress Marcy Lafferty, who got the job by sleeping with actor William Shatner. Now, that may seem salacious, but it's true. But of course, it's not as salacious as I make it out to be, because Marcy Lafferty was married to William Shatner at the time, and therefore was didn't get the job by sleeping so much as probably through nepotism. Now, when Marvel Comics acquired the license from Paramount to Star Trek, they were only allowed to use the characters that had appeared in the motion picture. So no characters such as Spock's parents from the original series or Arax and Maress from the animated series none of those were allowed to appear. So only characters like DeFalco, who debuted in the motion picture, could be used. So since Janice Rand and Dr. Chapel were used in the motion picture, they also could be used. Page 5, the barroom brawl scene was a good one. I like the action and fighting with fists, feet, and rapiers. It was a good way to mix things up. And of course, one thing you don't really want in a barroom brawl is phasers, which can disintegrate your opponents. It really makes for a short and really unfair fight. Page 6. Apparently, it took someone of higher rank than Kirk to get him to realize, at least to himself, that he was being edgy. It was good on Dr. McCoy that he pressed the issue and got Kirk to acknowledge both that he was being short-tempered and to acknowledge the reason for his edginess. Now, this issue's writer was Mike W. Barr, and he was a massive Star Trek fan. So I'm sure he loved working in the detail that Jim Kirk had once been assigned to the USS Republic. That detail was first mentioned in the original series, Season 1, Episode 14, The Court Martial. Page 7. All the talk in this issue about Arlf and Frawl remind me that both are anagrams of the English language name Ralph. And Prince Arlf and Ambassador Frawl, those royal titles, both remind me of the 1991 John Goodman film, King Ralph. Page 8. It was a very good touch by Mike W. Barr to build on established Trek lore and work in additional backstory for Jim Kirk. This was a frequent technique used on the original TV series and was almost never used in the Gold Key Star Trek comics. Page 9. This page showed the details that Kirk, Spock, and McCoy would use to investigate the case. Mike W. Barr was also a big fan of detective stories, and I'm sure he had a great time doing a Star Trek murder mystery. You may or may not recall that Mike W. Barr also created and wrote the Maze Agency comic book series published in the late 1980s by Comico and the early 1990s by Innovation. Also, notice the lizard-like crewmen in the fourth panel on this page. I'm pretty sure that is not a Gorn, but I don't know if it is said exactly who or what the crewman is. Page 10. Dave Cockrum is a great artist, and I love the way that even though Kirk, McCoy, and Spock were all wearing disguises, you could still tell them apart by their eyes and noses. So a very great way to show some artistic flourishes. You know, that's a detail that could easily have been overlooked. It's also a detail that could easily have been obscured through the heavy inking. As the tenure of Dave Cockrum and Klaus Janson on Star Trek comics has progressed, I do think that Klaus Janson has his inking has mitigated itself somewhat. I know anyone who's listened to my critiques of the first 5 issues of Marvel Star Trek have said that my biggest complaint is that Klaus Janson's inks were too heavy for the book. You know, the heavy inks were great for a moody, atmospheric run on Daredevil, but they seemed out of place for Gene Roddenberry's Star Trek. But I think he is easing up on the darkness somewhat, and that was especially evidenced by the fact that his heavy inks did not obscure the minute details that Dave Cockrum put for the eyes and noses on the trio underneath the Yanidian disguises. Page 11. Bones is as tactful as ever on this page when, while examining the body of Dr. Lorock, he says, "She's dead, Jim." I'm sure on YouTube, if you look around, you can probably find a supercut of all the times Dr. McCoy used the term, he's dead or she's dead, Jim. It got to be a bit of a cliche in Star Trek. Page 12. The natives of Yaned 6 were a interesting race with a very distinctive visual look, and they make their only Star Trek appearance in this issue. Until I read the listing for them on memory-beta.fandom.com, I hadn't even noticed that they had tails. And they have to be referred to as Yaned 6 natives, no demonym was ever officially given to them. I call them Yanidians. Now, interestingly, the prince mistakenly refers to the planet as Yaned 4, so instead of Yaned VI, it's Yaned IV, which was probably just a typo. Page 13. It is interesting that Spock chose to bluff, basically lie, as he later states he does not have the level of telepathic ability as described on this page. Vulcans are not supposed to lie. Now, Spock did famously speak in code in the film Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan. That's the scene where he tells Captain Kirk over an open communication channel, so Khan and Khan's crew can overhear the transmission. He tells Kirk that if we go by the book as Lieutenant Savick would have us, hours would seem like days. How long will the repairs take? If we go by the book, 2 days. And then, so basically the code was, if you go by the book, 2 days. If you don't go by the book, 2 hours. And of course, Scotty is famous for multiplying his repair factors. There's a scene in Star Trek 3 where Kirk says to Scotty, how long will it take to repair the damage? 8 weeks, sir. But you don't have 8 weeks, so I'll do it for you in 2. Page 14. The scheme as detailed on this page was a clever one, of both interrupting and substituting the person being beamed aboard. However, the knowledge of Ambassador Frall's criminal activity was not foreshadowed. When Mike W. Barr wrote The Maze Agency, he wrote each issue as a fair play mystery, which means that the readers would be given all of the clues needed to solve the case. So this was not a fair play mystery, because many details, such as Ambassador Frall's criminal past, were not provided to the reader. Page 15. Bones injects the ambassador with the most powerful knockout drug he has. However, it would be unlikely that he would know that he would be injecting anything into a Yaned 6 native. I mean, he just happened to have a hypo spray, and how would he even know what a safe but effective dosage would be for their physiology? I mean, since the Yaned 6 natives were not members of the Federation, presumably there would not be a lot of medical logs. And while there certainly might be some research, who knows how much of that Dr. McCoy would have had available when he was preparing this hypospray. Well, I better pack this hypospray just in case I need to, knock out somebody on the planet. It's unlikely. So a bit of a plot stretch there. Page 16. I thought writer Mike W. Barr did a good job summing up the resolution to this mystery. And on page 17, the final caption was a good summation of how writer Mike W. Barr felt about Star Trek. One moment, it is a starship, the most awe-inspiring of all man-made sights. Then warp speed is achieved, and then the USS Enterprise becomes a pinprick of light, joining a heaven filled with light, as though it has gone home. So, Mike W. Barr managed to write a very detailed plot to fit into the 17 pages he was allowed. Now, these comics are very different from the modern comics, with the decompressed storytelling and the emphasis on telling the story through subtle artistic touches instead of lengthy prose captions. As I mentioned before, the Star Trek Klingon story I thought was a little stretched. However, there was still a lot of the story and background that was told through the art and not in any text. For example, I like the fact that you could tell the Klingons apart merely by looking at the ridges on their heads. I like the fact that you could tell the flashback scenes just by while the primary scene would have rectangular panel borders, but the flashback scenes would have jagged panel edges. I do think that the story was a little too sparse with the dialogue, and I certainly felt that the extra story pages, they could have filled them up with more story background. So it's always a challenge to get the balance, and of course, the writers rarely get to dictate how many pages they have to tell their story in. I haven't had any feedback yet for my Star Trek episodes. Honestly, given the lack of feedback, I'm considering cutting back on the number of Star Trek comics I talk about. So I'll still talk about them, but perhaps not as much as I talk about the Justice League and Justice Society comics. So instead of making Star Trek half of Justice Trek, I might make them only a third. So Justice Society, Justice League, and Star Trek. But if you think you like the Star Trek and you want it to remain half of the show, by all means, drop me some feedback. You can contact me on Twitter, drop a comment here on YouTube, or email me at thejusticetrek@gmail.com. Just remember, my previous episodes are available for your viewing pleasure. These include episode 16, where I covered 2022 Star Trek Klingons from IDW, and episode 17, where I talked about Challenge of the Weapons Master from 1960's The Brave and the Bold, number 29. Please join me for my next episode, where I will cover 1978's Justice League of America number 161, which is the issue where Zatanna joins the team. And please join me for the following episode, where I will discuss 2022 Star Trek number 1 from IDW. Please click like, please click subscribe, and hey, keep on Justice Trekking.